In the footage, right here, you walk to the rear of the vehicle, you stop, you look.
I didn't know. I didn't even know she was there.
Billy told us what you said in that car, Lisa.
I can't get under this.
There is a question that has haunted criminal courts for generations, not just in law books, but in the quiet space between a verdict and a sentence. What is the difference between an accident and a choice? Because most of us, when confronted with that line, assume we would know. We assume guilt would be obvious. We assume a person who would just run over their own grandchild would stop the car and try to help that baby. We assume that whatever else could be said about them, that love, at minimum, would make them stay. What you are about to watch will challenge every one of those assumptions. On June 16, 2023, a white Chevrolet Trailblazer rolled over an 18-month-old girl in the parking lot of a Motel 6 in Jeffersonville, Indiana. The driver did not stop. She did not call 911. She did not pull over at the end of the block or the end of the street or anywhere on the expressway she took toward Louisville. She kept going. And the reason she kept going, as confirmed by the man sitting right beside her, would ultimately land her in prison for 12 years. That driver was the little girl's grandmother. Here is the detail that most people never hear. Lisa Tesch had 32 prior felony convictions before she ever set foot in that parking lot. The judge who sentenced her would later call it, and these are her exact words, a total callous disregard for human life. And the evidence the state assembled to prove it is unlike anything I've documented in this series. This is the case of Eleanor Campbell. She was 18 months old, but she never got to be 2. If you study cases where the system actually works, subscribe right now. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Jeffersonville, Indiana, is not a city that makes national news very often. It sits just across the Ohio River from Louisville, Kentucky, close enough that you can see the Louisville skyline from its riverbanks. It is a working-class town, the kind of place where families stretch every dollar, where a Motel 6 is sometimes not a vacation stop, but a temporary home. On the afternoon of June 16, 2023, it became the backdrop for one of the most heartbreaking cases this department had seen in years. The call came in as a hit-and-run involving a child. Officers arrived to find Eleanor Campbell, a toddler not yet 2 years old, lying unconscious in the grass outside the motel. Her parents, Zachary and Cheyenne, were already there. From the bodycam footage, you can hear the exact second a father realizes he is powerless. His voice breaks through the radio static, raw and desperate, repeating that she is his daughter, that the child on the ground is his little girl, as paramedics form a wall around her and work compressions. One officer, trying to manage the chaos without making it worse, gently positions himself between Zachary and the scene. There's a phone down there, you can call someone. But Zachary doesn't want to call someone. He wants to be where his daughter is. Another officer holds him back, not coldly, but with the quiet firmness of someone who has learned that sometimes keeping a parent out of the way is the only way to save the child they love. Cheyenne is in a different kind of shock. Hers is not the shock of disbelief. She knows exactly what she saw. Even in those first minutes, while Eleanor's mother is being driven toward Norton Children's Hospital in Louisville, she begins to talk. She tells the officer in the vehicle with her what happened. The words come out broken, urgent, a woman trying to get the most important sentence of her life out of her mouth before someone stops listening. She ran her over and she didn't stop. She called for her to come to her car and then she took off. She knew she ran her over and she just kept going. The she Cheyenne was referring to was not a stranger. It was not a reckless driver who had no idea there were children in the parking lot. It was Lisa Tesch, 51 years old, Zachary's mother, Eleanor's grandmother, a woman who, by all accounts, had come to the motel that afternoon for the most ordinary of reasons, to drop off money so her son could pay for another night's stay. She had driven over in her white Trailblazer, handed the cash through the window, and was preparing to leave. What happened in the next 60 seconds would take 2.5 years to fully unravel in a courtroom. Back at the scene, officers began to piece together the timeline. Security cameras at the Motel 6 had captured partial footage of the incident. Witnesses described a white Trailblazer. The vehicle was traced back to Lisa Tesch within hours. But Lisa was gone, already making her way across the Ohio River, already putting distance between herself and what she had done. A statewide manhunt was initiated, and detectives turned to the one person they knew had been in that vehicle when Eleanor was struck. They turned to Billy.
Billy was not a criminal. He was not a co-conspirator. He was an ordinary man who had the terrible misfortune of being in the wrong vehicle at the worst possible moment. He would sometimes ride along with Lisa when she went to pick up free items listed on Facebook Marketplace, furniture, appliances, things people were giving away. That afternoon, that was supposed to be the plan, but Lisa had made a stop first. The motel, the money, her son. By the time detectives sat down with Billy, they had already reviewed what footage they had from the motel's exterior cameras. They knew the broad strokes. What they needed was the texture, the detail that only a person inside that vehicle could provide, and Billy gave it to them, all of it. He described the moment Lisa started to pull out of the parking space. He described hearing a voice, Cheyenne's voice, shouting from the direction of the hotel room door, "Stop! Stop!" The radio was on, so it came through faintly, like an alarm you're not sure you heard. Billy turned his head, and when he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw something that would never leave him. He saw the car go over the baby. Here is where the legal concept of consciousness of guilt becomes critical to understand, because it is what separates this case from a tragic accident. Under American evidentiary law, reinforced by cases like United States v. Silverman and State v. Parker, Indiana, 1994, a defendant's post-crime behavior is not just morally relevant, it is legally admissible. It tells the jury, this person knew. The law recognizes that innocent people do not flee. Innocent people do not accelerate. Innocent people do not spend weeks hiding from law enforcement after a child dies in their parking lot. According to Billy, after the car went over Eleanor, Lisa did not brake gradually. She did not pull to the side. She did not say anything that sounded like a person trying to decide what to do. She said, "Oh my God," and she spun off. That was the phrase Billy used, spun off. The kind of language that describes not confusion, but velocity, not hesitation, but escape. And here is what makes the legal picture even darker. Lisa Tesch knew she had an outstanding warrant in Grayson County. She would later admit as much to detectives. That warrant, not Eleanor's safety, not her son's grief, not her granddaughter bleeding in the grass, was the calculation she made in those seconds. Under Indiana Code Section 926.1.1, once you are aware that an accident has occurred and a person may be injured, your legal obligation to stop is absolute. No exception exists for active warrants. No exception exists for panic. The law is unambiguous, and Lisa Tesch drove away anyway. Meanwhile, the family was fracturing in real time. Zachary, standing in the parking lot while paramedics worked on his daughter, was informed by officers that he had an active warrant for his own arrest, 2 counts of domestic battery. The officers had no discretion. Under the Supreme Court's ruling in Atwater v. City of Lago Vista, law enforcement is required to execute valid warrants regardless of circumstance. Zachary was handcuffed while Eleanor was still on the grass. He was walked to a patrol car while his daughter was being loaded into an ambulance. The Atwater precedent says this is lawful, but lawful and right are not always the same thing, and the footage of that moment is one of the most painful sequences in this entire documentary. Cheyenne reached the hospital alone. Sadly, Eleanor did not survive.
Weeks have passed. Lisa has been found and brought in. In a parallel room, Billy sits under fluorescent light across from the detective. This is the moment the whole case turns on. The detective leaned forward across the table, his voice deliberately low, the kind of measured quiet that is more unsettling than shouting. He had been patient through the earlier part of the interview. He had let Billy describe the day, the drive, the stop at the motel. He had let the details accumulate, and now he was ready to ask the only question that mattered. She knew she hit the baby, though, right? Billy looked down, his jaw tightened. The silence stretched exactly long enough for it to mean something. Then he lifted his eyes. Right, she did know that, yes. In a separate room, Lisa Tesch sat with her hands folded on the table, staring at its surface. She had maintained throughout her own interview that she hadn't known, that she'd felt something but hadn't understood what it was, that she hadn't realized, that she would never, could never have left if she had known it was Eleanor. Billy's voice continued, quiet and certain. 'Cause that's when she said, oh my God," and just spun off. The detective sat back slowly. The room held it. Then, almost to himself, barely audible, she knew. 2 words. The emotional weight of 26 months of investigation, a weeks-long manhunt, and a family's irreplaceable grief compressed into 2 words. She knew. It wasn't anger in the detective's voice. It was something quieter than that. The specific exhaustion of a person who suspected the truth for a long time and has just had it confirmed. She knew, and she left anyway. And an 18-month-old baby is no more. What Billy described was not ambiguity. It was not a driver in shock who did not understand what had happened. It was a woman who heard her own voice say, "Oh my God," the involuntary verbal acknowledgement of a terrible thing, and then made the decision in that same breath to press the accelerator and leave. That is not an accident followed by confusion. That is an accident followed by a choice. In the weeks following the incident, as investigators assembled their case and waited for Lisa Tesch to be located, forensic psychologists working with law enforcement on cases of this type were asked a question that the public rarely hears. Why does someone flee a scene like this? Why does a grandmother, someone with a biological and emotional bond to the child she has just injured, choose escape over accountability? The answer, in this case, is best explained through a psychological concept known as defensive self-deception, and more specifically, its forensic manifestation in what criminologists call minimization denial response syndrome. This is not a courtroom defense. It is a behavioral framework that forensic psychologists use to explain why certain offenders, particularly those with extensive criminal histories and trauma backgrounds, respond to catastrophic events with flight and denial rather than remorse and surrender. The pattern is well documented in academic literature, including in Gudjonson and Bones' foundational research on criminal self-perception, 1991, and in Kenneth Polk's analysis of offender response patterns in unintentional homicide cases. Here is how it works. When a person with a deeply entrenched survival-oriented psychological profile, shaped by decades of encounters with the criminal justice system, by a history of consequences avoided, by a pattern of choosing self-preservation over accountability, experiences a moment of acute crisis, the brain does not process it as, "I have harmed someone I love." It processes it as, "I am in danger." The emotional centers of the brain, the amygdala in particular, override the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for empathy, long-term reasoning, and moral calculus. The result is a fight or flight response, and in Lisa's case, it was pure flight. What is especially revealing about this case is the way that self-deception then became a post hoc narrative. By the time Lisa Tesch sat down with investigators on July 13th, nearly a month after Eleanor's death, she had had weeks to construct an internal story that protected her from the full weight of what she had done. "I didn't know my baby was under my car. I didn't feel anything. I would have stopped if I'd known." This is classic minimization, not lying for strategic advantage, but a psychological restructuring of memory to make the self tolerable. The forensic problem with this type of minimization is that it is self-reinforcing. The longer a person maintains a minimized version of events, the more neurologically real it becomes. This is why Lisa's denials in interrogation did not read as cold calculation. They read as genuine belief. She had, to some extent, convinced herself. But the surveillance footage, the physics of the Trailblazers' movement, and Billy's unimpeachable eyewitness account made the self-deception irrelevant in a court of law. Judge Lisa Glickfield addressed this directly at sentencing. She noted that while she believed Tesh may have developed genuine remorse in the years since Eleanor's death, that remorse was conspicuously absent in the hours and days that followed, the window that mattered most. The judge used the phrase callous disregard deliberately, because callousness in this legal and psychological context does not require cruelty as a motive. It requires only the absence of care at the moment care was most demanded. Lisa Tesch's prior record, 32 felony convictions before this case, tells its own story. It is not a record of impulsive criminality alone. It is a decades-long behavioral pattern of choosing self-interest over consequence, of navigating the justice system with the street-smart fluency Billy himself described to detectives. "She knows the game," he said. "She knows how to hide all that." In forensic terms, what Billy was describing is an individual with deeply habituated avoidance behavior, someone for whom flight is not a panic response, but a learned default. It is a distinction that matters, because it speaks to risk of reoffending, and it speaks to why a judge imposed 12 years rather than a fraction of that. On December 12, 2025, Lisa Tesch stood in a Clark County courtroom before Judge Lisa Glickfield and entered her guilty plea to one count of failure to remain at the scene of an accident resulting in death, a Level 3 felony under Indiana Code 926(1.1.1). The sentencing range for a Level 3 felony in Indiana is 3 to 16 years, with an advisory sentence of 9 years. Tesh received 12. Judge Glickfield's decision to exceed the advisory sentence was anchored in 3 factors: the nature and circumstance of the offense involving the death of a toddler, the defendant's extensive criminal history, including 16 prior misdemeanors and 32 prior felony convictions, and the complete absence of any mitigating action taken in the immediate aftermath of the incident. The judge stated that while she believed Tesh had developed some degree of remorse in the intervening years, she could not and would not allow that late-arriving regret to outweigh what the evidence showed about her conduct on June 16, 2023. It was a total, callous disregard for human life, and not only is it human life, but it is a toddler. I mean, it is an innocent toddler. 12 years. For Eleanor Campbell, who never got to be 2. For Cheyenne, who watched her daughter loaded into an ambulance and never brought her home. For Zachary, who was handcuffed in a parking lot while paramedics tried to save his child. For Billy, who will live the rest of his life with the image he described in that interrogation room, the rearview mirror, the baby, the car going over. For all of them, the sentence is not enough. It never is. But it is the maximum the charge could credibly carry, applied by a judge who did not flinch from the weight of what was in front of her. Lisa Tesch is currently serving her sentence at the Indiana Department of Corrections. She will not be eligible for release until Eleanor's surviving siblings, the 2 little babies Zachary wept about in the parking lot on June 16th, are teenagers. Justice in this case was not swift. It was not simple. It took 2.5 years, a statewide manhunt, a key witness with the courage to tell the full truth, and a judge with the moral clarity to call callousness by its name. But it arrived, and in true crime, that is not always guaranteed. If this case made you feel something, if it made you angry or heartbroken, or more resolved to pay attention to the stories that don't always make the front page, then you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me, was 12 years justice, or was it a compromise the system made that Eleanor's family will spend the rest of their lives thinking about? I read every comment. Subscribe right now so you don't miss the next one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because silence in cases like this is never neutral.